on the internet, somebody posted a message from apparently a school teacher who was so distraught at the way her students were writing their essays that she thought she would post on the internet an example of a typical student's essay. And the essay was quite lengthy, and the opening sentence of it was then reproduced millions of times. It got into the newspapers, it became headline news. This is how students apparently are writing their essays these days. What on earth does it mean? This is what it means. Now, the point about it is that this was a hoax. There never was any such essay. It was written probably by a young person wanting to show the potential of this new medium. It was a pretend teacher. Nobody has ever tracked down any real teacher from any real school that wrote this. And yet everybody believed it. Everybody suddenly said, yes, this is what the students are doing these days. Isn't it disgusting? And that is why John Humphreys will say, look at what they are doing to the English language. Isn't it awful? You can't understand it. And indeed, if it were all like that, it would be difficult to understand. But of course, it isn't. This is a pastiche. It is a parody. It is a hoax. The reality is like this. These are examples of real text messages that I picked up in a large collection when I made it for a book a few years ago. What you'll notice is that they're all pretty short messages indeed, but if you were to count up all the abbreviations in those messages, what would you count? You might count the X's, the kisses in the first line, the C and the U in the second line, maybe the 5 as well, another X, a short form of time and the and train and get in the third line, a U in the fourth, and the 2 and the U again, another U in the fifth, and that curious smiley perhaps you might count, the B in the sixth and a 7, and nothing at all in the 8th. And these are typical. Now, a number of people have collected thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of messages of this kind and counted up all the abbreviated forms that are in them and worked out the proportion of abbreviations to the number of words that are not abbreviated. And do you know what the average is? The average is 10%. In other words, 10% of the words in text messages have abbreviations like C and U. 90% of the words in text messages have normal standard English spelling. And this finding has been replicated for other languages as well. I have no idea whether anybody's done anything similar for Croatian, but they've certainly done it for French and German and Swedish and a number of other languages. In other words, it is not the case that people are filling their messages with abbreviations. On average, 10%. That means some people do 20%, and some people don't put any in at all. 10% is an average. Moreover, remember the following fact, and that is that the vast majority of text messages in the world are sent not by young people, but by the less young. I don't use the word old, I don't recognize the concept. Now, most text messages are sent by adults, by the stock market telling you about latest reports if you signed in, by organizations informing you about all kinds of information, by broadcasting authorities sending out messages about the new programs that are there, by publishers, by teachers, by everybody. We all use text messages these days, and interestingly, many of the institutions that send out texts ban abbreviations. You're not allowed to use them, and the reason is that they are ambiguous often, and people might not be able to understand them, so they don't use them. So, although young people use abbreviations quite a lot, it isn't the case that old people do. Oh, sorry, less young people do. Moreover, I did a study in a school a little while ago, where I went to the sixth formers, that is the 16, 17-year-olds, and said, let's have a collection of your text messages. And they showed me them, and there were hardly any abbreviations there at all. So I said to them, why don't you abbreviate? They said, oh, we did that when we were younger. So we went down to the fifth formers, a year below, and collected their text messages. There were indeed more abbreviations there. Why don't you use more? They said, we used to when we were younger. And we went all the way down the school until we got to the first year of secondary, 11-year-olds, and they were full of abbreviations. In other words, the younger you are, the newer you are to text messaging, the more you like the novelty, the more it's cool to put lots of abbreviations in. The older you get, 17, 18, the more it's naff, the more it's immature, boring. A lot of sixth formers said, I never abbreviate, or just occasionally. So there is a rapid transmission period for this new kind of abbreviation. What about the point that it's random, that the kids are leaving letters out randomly? Well, that is definitely not the case, as this next illustration will show. You're there? If you can read this, then what's the problem? What's been left out? The vowels, of course. And this is absolutely systematic. People leave out vowels and occasional consonants. It's because the consonants carry most information in a language. This is a basic truth of information theory. Consonants carry the information. There are some languages, as you know, that don't bother with vowels at all, or leave them optional. Languages like Hebrew and Arabic and so on. Compare it with this next. What would happen if we left out the consonants? Could you read that? Yeah, that one's all right. Sorry, this one hasn't got any vowels. That's leaving out the vowels. This next one, sorry, I'm ahead of myself. This sentence hasn't got any vowels. Well, whatever it's saying, you wouldn't be able to read it. So that makes the point, the kids know, they instinctively know that consonants are important and vowels are not. Now, nobody taught them this. No adult ever said to the kids, leave out vowels, keep consonants. They worked this out for themselves. It's instinctive, almost, which shows that the whole process isn't random. Now, the third point in the argument. Is the abbreviatory system new? Have the kids invented these letters and abbreviations for themselves? Is it something part of 20th, 21st century technology? And the answer here again has got to be no. Let's take a random sample of some of these abbreviations. Are these new? No, they're not. C and U at the top. You will find these in English going back 200 years. A century ago, over a century ago, when Queen Victoria was on the throne, she used to play games with her children, rebus games, they would be called in those days. And she abbreviated words like C and U in this way. Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, plays games in which words are abbreviated in this way. Most of the abbreviations that you encounter in text messaging have actually got quite an ancient history behind them. Some of them are more common than others, of course. C and U, for example, very, very common indeed. Something like atoms, less common. But you'll find that most of them have a long history. And this is not surprising, because it's a very natural thing to abbreviate in a language. In English, the history of abbreviation goes back over 1,000 years. If you look at some manuscripts in Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons, you will find some of the earliest abbreviations in English there. The word "and," for example, abbreviated by a little sign. It looks like a 7. And that's the symbol for "and" in Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. Abbreviation has always been part of the language. There is nothing new about the abbreviations that young people use. Oh, there are a few new ones, of course, a few inventions that don't have a history. LOL is a very good example, laughing out loud. Queen Victoria never used that. But then we know Queen Victoria never laughed out loud. You will remember, we are not amused. But most of the others are common. Before, for instance, you'll find a history for that. Today, a history for that. And X's for kisses you can trace right back to Chaucer's time. So, the abbreviations are not new. Let's have a look at some of them in a bit more detail. Here's a slide with some of the new ones in. And CWOT was in the extract that you saw a little earlier on. Now people say this illustrates the modern trend. I would never do that when I was their age, is the common parental comment. Wrong. Look at this next slide. You've all used the first two. Everybody knows what they are. I'm not even going to bother to gloss them. What about the third one and the fourth one? Have you come across these? Well, this is what they mean. Now, sealed with a loving kiss is absolutely normal on love letters, on the envelopes containing love letters that were sent by the young people's, well, if not parents' generation, certainly their grandparents' generation. Certainly when I was around in those far-off days, not that I had many love affairs, you know, but still one tries. And the envelope that is sent, when you close the envelope, you write across the back, S-W-A-L-K, sealed with a loving kiss. And it was one of the commonest devices that was used in those days. Hardly used now, I suppose. TTFN, very much a Second World War abbreviation used by people in the Army and the Air Force and elsewhere. It was forces slang to begin with, and then it became widely used on the radio and became used in the general public as a result. So here we've got initialisms, as you might call them. That is, the initial letters of the words are being used to form the abbreviation. And these have quite a lengthy history. NB and IOU you can trace back to the 17th century and the 16th century. Another type of abbreviation is when you leave letters out, as you saw earlier on, as in this next example. These are modern examples: message with the vowels left out and some of the consonants too, of course, and excellent again with vowels gone and a couple of consonants simplified. Is this a novelty? Is this something that the young people have introduced? Not so. Here's the next slide with more abbreviations on it. You'll find all these in modern text messaging, but where did I get these from? I got these from a book by Eric Partridge, a great lexicographer in English, a dictionary of abbreviations published in 1942. You see, nothing new about this sort of thing at all, long before text messaging was ever invented. This next sort of abbreviation is different again. These are where non-standard forms are used in the language. Things like this. These are non-standard spellings. Cause for because, love for love, what for what, and so on. Are these new? Is this something that comes in text messaging? Not a bit. Each of these you will find in Charles Dickens, or Emily Bronte, or anybody in the 19th century writing a novel and wanting to put into it an impression of regional speech, and you'll find all of these spellings there. Take the third one, for instance. It became famous in the Second World War in English-speaking contexts because of Mr. Chad.